Welcome to another episode of the .NET Show. Now, we've been talking about developing applications for .NET for several episodes now. Without good development tools, it's really hard to develop a great application, whether it's for .NET or for anything. So I thought in this episode we would talk about VS.NET, the next version of Visual Studio that's been specifically designed for helping you to develop great .NET applications. But before we get to that, let's go check in with Erica and the news.
Hello, I'm Erica Wiechers. Welcome to the MSDN News Update. In May, Microsoft held its 5th annual CEO Summit. The summit was attended by over 160 CEOs from top companies around the world. The purpose of the Microsoft CEO Summit is to provide a forum which encourages discussions of important business issues for enterprise CEOs, such as creating long-term business value, improving competitiveness, adapting to change, and taking advantage of new technologies. At the summit, the CEOs learned about leading-edge uses of technology from their peers as well as experts from Microsoft. Also in May, Microsoft formally announced its plans to provide a 64-bit version of Windows in both Workstation and Advanced Server products. The 64-bit Windows platform addresses the expanding data needs of business, academic, engineering, and scientific organizations that are pushing the limits of existing information technology platforms. Availability is scheduled to coincide with both the October release of Windows XP as well as the commercial availability of computers that utilize the 64-bit Itanium chip from Intel. Registration is currently underway for Meltdown, Microsoft's conference for DirectX developers. The conference will be held July 16th through 18th in Seattle. Featured at this conference will be in-depth technical presentations of DirectX 8 as well as an overview of DirectX 9. Technical tracks will be provided by leading developers and hardware vendors to help attendees understand how to best use the various features and capabilities of DirectX in their game development. There is also a Meltdown scheduled for London, July 23rd through 25th. In June, MSDN launched a redesign of its website. The redesigned site features a new look and feel, improved navigation, and the merge of the Web Workshop and the MSDN library. Visit msdn.microsoft.com for a look at the new site. Be sure to check out the show transcript for links to more information on these news items. And that's been the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers.
Well, welcome to this segment of the .NET Show. In this architecture segment, we're going to talk about the architectural aspects associated with Visual Studio.NET. Here to talk to me about that is Peter Loforte, the Product Unit Manager for the Visual Studios environment, and Rob Copeland, the Product Unit Manager for VB.NET. So Peter, Microsoft has had a Visual Studio product for a while. What exactly is different about this new VS.NET?
Well, I like to view it in two different ways. First of all, the design time environment, and then the runtime environment. On the design time environment side, we, for the first time, have an integrated environment for Visual Basic developers, for C++ developers, C# developers, and third-party languages that can plug directly into the IDE. So we really give them a nice integrated environment where they can share tools such as editors and debuggers, so no matter what language they're working on, they have a common experience which makes them more productive and more successful building applications. The other pillar that I like to talk about is the runtime environment. For the first time, we have an integrated runtime, a set of frameworks on top of that, a set of languages on top of that, all targeting building web applications.
So like the Visual Studio concept, when it was first coming out many years ago, was trying to build toward this integrated environment. So the .NET environment just allows us actually to deliver upon creating a true, fully integrated environment for all programmers?
Absolutely. If you're a JScript developer, a VBScript developer, a Visual Basic developer...
Even JScript and VBScript work in this environment too?
Yes, they're all integrated in the environment. So you can write client-side VBScript, you can write server-side JScript, or client-side JScript, Visual Basic, C# or new language, C++, third-party languages like Perl, Python, COBOL, Haskell, Scheme. It's a really great integrated environment, no matter what your development background is.
And the other thing, just to add to that, is that all of the tools in Visual Studio now, the designers and the editors and so forth, are all shared across these languages as well. So to create a web form in Visual Basic, you use the same designer that you would if you were going to create one in C# and so forth. So we get a lot better synergy across the languages if you were going to use multiple languages when you were developing your application.
Now, well, something like that sounds like, the obvious thing to do. As a programmer, I know trying to get all those different components functional at that level across the different languages, across different, ways of developing applications can be pretty difficult. What sort of difficulties do you encounter trying to create this integrated development environment?
Well, one thing I can talk to is there's lots of great shared tools which need to be shared. I think everyone wants a great editor with great IntelliSense productivity features with red squigglies and blue squigglies. In case you do a syntax error, you don't have to compile first. And I think every language can benefit from that. Then there's some more advanced features which might be appropriate for C++, but Visual Basic developers might not find as appropriate. So we really have to have a balance as to what features are appropriate for what languages and what tools.
And so there's a team that's focusing on exactly how to create this more integrated setup between the VB and the C# and the JavaScript and VB programmers and such.
Exactly. And in the demo that we'll show you later, we actually have a profile which allows you to set up what type of developer you are, and then the environment will change based on your background.
You have something you can add?
I was just going to add that in addition to the team that you were just talking about that focused on this integration, they also worked very closely with the C++ team and the C# team and the Visual Basic team to make sure that from a VB customer's perspective, we liked the experience that we were delivering for Visual Basic, and then from a C++ developer perspective, the same thing. So we have one environment that meets the needs of all of our developers.
So you didn't have a problem with the different teams trying to take and outdo the other teams, so the VB team saying, oh, we're going to add some stuff over here that's kind of cool, and the C# people, oh, God, we should have added that instead.
Not really. I mean, that's part of the issue that led us to wanting to have an integrated environment. In the past, we had multiple teams focusing on separate environments, adding features, and then we'd have a situation where the C++ team would do some really great, cool feature the developers loved, and the VB guys wouldn't get it because it'd be in their shell and not in ours, and vice versa. And by focusing all of that energy on a common shell and then coming up with ways to target the shell towards different developers, we were able to leverage all of that work across all of our teams.
Now, does this new shell, does it change the way developers are going to have to write their applications? Does it improve things? Are there different ways to focus on designing an app to properly utilize the VS.NET shell?
Well, Visual Basic and C++ developers should be immediately, comfortable with the environment once they start. We still have projects, you have designers, you have code editors, you have debuggers, and we work really hard to make sure that those were familiar to people who use our tools today. So we feel really happy about that. We also have a much larger collection of project templates now to get people started. In addition, we have a very rich help system where if you're not familiar with the new types of applications that you can build in Visual Studio.NET, it's very easy for you to learn. And we'll demo that again later, showing you a bunch of new features such as dynamic help, integrated help in the environment, MSDN online integration, which really will give you a better starting point when you're trying to build a Visual Studio.NET application.
So you've also mentioned about the capability of having plug-in languages from third parties, stuff like that. How important do you think that is going to be for some of these developers out there?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. Just think of most websites today. Again, it's a combination of script maybe on the client, maybe script generated on the server, maybe components written in different languages, C++ or Visual Basic, XML data being integrated there. And in many cases, we found that, again, there's multiple languages being used. So the idea of having rich third-party languages integrated, such as Perl or Python or COBOL or Fortran, integrated in the Visual Studio environment, again, we're not telling you what language to use, we're just saying use the language that you're familiar with, and we guarantee you will have a nice shared experience in our environment with it.
And it takes advantage of one of the best features of the .NET framework, and that at the runtime level, all of these languages are first-class citizens, so they all plug in at the same level, they can all share the infrastructure that's there, they can all inherit each other's classes and so forth, so you don't have to learn a new language to be very productive in .NET. You can use the language you're familiar with and then use the best tools there are on the market to target those applications and those languages.
So let's say I was a developer and I was making a port of the fourth language onto CLR, and so I got it working in the CLR. Would it be an awful lot more work for me to do to get it working within the Visual Studio .NET environment, or is it fairly simple from that standpoint?
Well, it would take a little work. I mean, it's definitely meant for more sophisticated developers. You plug in your language service, so for instance, you get the right color coding in the editor. If you want some of the more advanced features like IntelliSense and statement completion, again, you have to plug in services for that.
Because all that stuff is more than what the .NET environment itself is needing. Just to run the language, you're actually needing to understand the language constructs itself as well.
Exactly.
Okay. And you provide tools and documentation?
Yeah, we have a Visual Studio Integrators program, and we have an SDK that comes with that, which gives you all the documentation that you need to plug in. And I should note that that API, the set of APIs that are exposed to third parties, those are the exact same ones we used internally. So we know they're well tested. We know they give you deep hooks into the IDE to really give you a level of integration that we've never had available before.
So essentially, C# and VB are both being third-party add-ins essentially to your own product.
You could do it like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How many other languages do you think are coming out right now for Visual Studio.NET? Do you have any feeling for that number?
I would say somewhere around a dozen.
Yeah,
a dozen for
12
launch.
to 15.
Some of those will be commercially available. Some will be used in academia for experimentation, educational purposes.
Some will come out sooner than others. They're not all coming out at the same time. It'll be a kind of a rolling thing where.
Now, if I was a company, let's say like Boeing or something like that, and for whatever reason I wanted to take and develop my own language for assisting my programmers in developing applications for my specific hardware that I might have, would it be very difficult for a company to specialize in their own private language for Visual Studio.NET?
You'd have to become a Visual Studio Integrators program partner, but once you have the SDK documentation, again, if you were a sophisticated developer, it should be fairly straightforward.
And you'd want to structure your language in such a way that it was a top-tier .NET language from the get-go, so that it integrated very well with all of our other infrastructure and tools and designers and so forth. And there's a set of documentation in the .NET SDK that talks about how to do that. And since we've turned over C# and the Common Language Infrastructure to ECMA as a standard, there's already a set of information available out there today that can be used to see how these languages are created and how the runtime's created.
Mm-hmm. Well, how important do you think .NET is to the Visual Studio environment itself?
I think it's very important. I think that creating applications that integrate web services across the internet, across your intranet, across many different companies is a really, really important thing for our developers to be able to do. And targeting Visual Studio.NET at making the creation of those applications very, very easy has been our #1 job for the past few years while we've been working on this.
Now, you kind of mentioned about developing applications for the internet and intranet. Now, that's getting into websites. Now, I always think of like the Visual Studio environment as being something creating a Windows application, full smart application for it. But now you're talking about creating web-based applications. How does Visual Studio support the notion of web apps versus Windows apps?
We support both of them equally well. We've got a set of features all about creating HTML pages, both dynamic HTML, very rich HTML that hosts in a browser, and HTML 3.2 so that it can target any browser. That set of features, the designer in Visual Studio is called the Web Forms Designer, and that's built on top of ASP.NET. So that
is that the same thing as like Visual InterDev used to be, or is it something totally different than that?
It's like a next generation Visual InterDev. What we did is we took a lot of the best ideas that were in Visual InterDev and broadened them so that they were available to all of the languages in Visual Studio. So in this version of Visual Studio, for example, there's no separate product called Visual InterDev. We've taken those features and just married them with the rest of the languages. So this is like a next generation of the design experience you had in Visual InterDev, where you can use a WYSIWYG layout tool to create an HTML page, and you can create compiled code that lives behind that page and executes when people click buttons or enter fields or so forth. So it's a very similar environment to what people are used to in both Visual InterDev and Visual Basic.
So the same skills you had before in developing a VB application or a graphical-based C++ application, now you can develop web-based applications with forms and stuff like that as well, or?
Yes. The other part of what we were just talking about is forms, or the Windows Forms, which are the rich Windows Forms package that allows you to take advantage of all the richness that Windows provides on the desktop and still very tightly integrate with web services that live out on your intranet or in the internet itself.
Now, I can imagine that if you're developing a web-based application, you're going to have to need the .NET services running on the web server itself to a certain extent.
Yes.
What about the clients that are attaching to those? Would they also all need to be running .NET or even Windows as well?
It depends on the type of application you're trying to create. If you're going to create an application that uses rich Windows forms that I was just talking about, they would need Windows on the client, and you'd also need the .NET runtime on the client. If you were going to create a web application that's just purely HTML-based, you could just have any browser running on the client, whether it's Internet Explorer or Netscape or Opera or any of those, and just use HTML 3.2. You'd still have .NET running on the server to provide the runtime environment for your Visual Basic or C# or C++ code, but it would just serve up HTML that would be sent down to the client.
So you see Visual Studio is moving more towards supporting web applications, or you still think that there is a big market for the Windows-based rich smart client applications?
Well, I actually think, rich Windows clients are great. You get the full interactivity, the power of the desktop machine, the CPU cycles you get to take advantage of, do highly interactive UI. So absolutely see a need for that. And Visual Studio has always been good at that, and we've modified it, made it better. WinForms is a better forms package than we had before, which now C# can take advantage of. So creating rich client applications still super high priority in Visual Studio. Then mentioning, furthering what Rob said, we've basically taken all the great features in Visual InterDev and made them part of Visual Basic and C# and C++. So absolutely, you have a first-class ability to create HTML pages, ASP.NET pages, cascading style sheets, create rich server components which integrate with web pages, XML built right in, and we'll show some of that in the demo. It's pretty exciting. So absolutely, we've had a big emphasis on the web in this release, but we absolutely think that creating rich client applications is key as well.
Yeah. We actually think that having both sets of functionality lets you build the best possible types of applications. And our customers have been telling us for a while they want really great HTML support, but what we found is a lot of things that people want to do with HTML either can't be done or very, very difficult when they want to get to some very rich drag-and-drop, menu-based, Windows-based UIs. And the ability to create a set of both that interact very closely using web services is exactly what they want.
So you think that the world of the standard Windows application still has a long ways to go, and you're still going to see a lot of rich applications coming in?
Oh, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
Kind of like the right tool for the right job. There's some things that the web works really well for. There's other things that you really need to have an application running on your desktop system.
And we're saying you can do either, and you can interoperate either now as well. So you can create web services that bring XML down to a rich client application.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we're talking here, the beta 2 of .NET has not yet quite come out yet, and understand that VS.NET is going to be included with that. Now, some people watching the show, probably even after .NET is fully available, what are some of the changes that people are going to see from the beta 1 of VS.NET to beta 2, and then from beta 2 on to the final product?
Okay, well, one of the features that we'll show in the demo, which I'm really excited about, is web hosting. So you can create a web service or a web application, run that on your local server or some server within your intranet. But let's say you want to get it onto the internet. That's typically a difficult thing to do. Well, within the developer division here at Microsoft, we've teamed up with various web hosters that actually display within the Visual Studio IDE the ability to sign up with one of those web hosters and then automatically deploy one of your Visual Studio products to that web hosting site to make your web service or web application publicly available on the internet.
It's just kind of like a one-click hosting.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've also, just for people that have been using our beta 1, I think what they'll find in beta 2 is that we've got less bugs, more performance. It's an all-around better experience than beta 1 was. One of the things that we're trying to target with beta 2 is being able to build real applications and even start to deploy them and get a feel for how they're going to work for you.
Well, after all, it still is a beta, right?
Right.
Yes.
So then what sort of changes do people expect to see between beta 2 and like the final release of .NET and VS.NET? Are there certain features and capabilities you're trying to add in or just solidify on things?
Actually, we're just trying to solidify on things. Between beta 2 and our release to manufacturing, there'll be very little new work done other than just fixing bugs. We've still got some performance work to do, but it's really about polishing everything up and making sure it's ready to go out.
And also responding to the key critical beta 2 feedback that we receive. So
right.
People out there using Visual Studio beta 2, please send us the feedback as soon as you can so we can evaluate that and put it into the RTM product as needed.
Mm-hmm. Now, if there's some key things, key messages you get across to some new developer who's just thinking about using VS.NET, what are some of the key points you'd want to take to make sure they really understood to make them capable of writing the best possible applications?
Well, I think I would say that some of the things that they're going to need to keep at the forefront, first off, is they're going to have a little bit of learning to do. While Peter said that it's a very familiar environment for C++ and Visual Basic developers, and it is. I mean, we've got the languages that they're used to and a design experience that's very similar. When we think about creating web applications, there's some learning that has to be done. We've got a new platform. We've got a great set of frameworks that sit on top of that platform that provide a host of functionality for creating Windows applications and web applications, but there's some new things there. So I would say expect to take a little bit of time to look through what we're adding in this version, because there's a host of new features and functionality. And I think if you step back, we've got some great features, and we'll show some of them in our demo, that the environment helps you along in this learning phase with a much more tightly integrated help system. But I think people should expect to take a little time to see what's there, play around with it a little bit, kick the tires.
Does your help system include Clippy?
It does not include Clippy. Okay. It's a better way of help than Clippy.
Clippy didn't make it into Visual Studio.net.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Not many people were sorry about that.
Did you have any key points you thought would be important for developers to understand about the Visual Studio.net environment?
Well, I mean, the environment is new, and we, like Rob said, we took the best that was there before, the productivity features of Visual Basic and the great power and flexibility of C++ to create a richer environment. But the key, I think, when building .NET applications is that there is a new architecture there. We have a new runtime, a new set of base classes, XML and data pervasive through that. We have new languages. So be prepared to learn not only necessarily a new environment, a more in-depth environment, but also be prepared to learn the new application architecture. Creating web services is kind of like creating components in Visual Basic 6.0, but it's web-enabled. So learning the application architecture is something that you can do absolutely through the new improved help system, and also by starting with the project templates that are available to you.
Well, thank you. We've been talking about this demo quite a bit. I think probably it's time to start showing these people what Visual Studio.net actually looks like. So if you want to wait for a couple seconds, we'll get that fired up.
Great.
So be sure to stay tuned. We're going to come back and show Visual Studio.net and a demonstration that illustrates some of the key features that are bringing to it. So after this short break, we'll be right back.
turn blue with the comfort within you. Go I sympathize with all our tears and all the gut wrench that come by. Years of separation, we never fill a empty room. The cost of last leaves us a sorrow. Alone with the choice, she must stand because the desperate blue, the comfort to fit you. Go and stand.
Welcome back. We're now going to take and focus on actually showing a demonstration of what's possible to do in VS.NET. Both Peter and Robert are here to help me with that and show me some cool features they've got set up for us. I guess, Peter, you were going to start off with something here?
Yeah, absolutely. Right in front of you, we have the start page in the Visual Studio environment. And this is what you see when you very first start Visual Studio. And again, as we were talking about earlier, developers are coming from different backgrounds. They could be script developers, C++ developers, writing device drivers. Basically, there's a wide variety of developers out there, and we wanted to make sure that this integrated environment would take advantage and make their lives easier. So the first thing I can do here is go to my profile, and I see these different profiles here. I could choose a C++ developer, and that moves the windows around, changes the keyboard binding, and the window layout and so on to make this more appropriate for a C++ developer or more familiar to a C++ developer. I can do the Visual Studio default, or in this case, I'm just going to choose a student developer profile.
Student developer?
Yes, Visual Studio, we have a new academic edition of it, which includes features specifically for students who are in classes in universities who want to learn how to do computing or do more advanced computing work. There's also features for faculty members, for teachers, so they can create courses, create assignments. They can send those assignments to students. Students can work on those assignments, submit them to the teachers. We have tools that automatically grade and build the assignments, make sure they're done on time, compare them to others. It's a very rich system to help ease kind of the overall burden of managing a computer science class.
Now, did you have a capability in that where you could actually drop your card punch cards, scatter them on the floor, and have to pick them all back up again? Or am I dating myself with that?
I think it's a little bit before a lot
Okay,
of the
okay.
viewers' age there, so not sure how old you are, but no, this is a little different. Okay, so I'll choose the student developer, and I'll show you some of those features I just mentioned. Notice in the student developer, we have a task list down here, and task list is a new feature for Visual Basic and C++ developers. It really is a useful aid to tell you where your errors are in your code. It's a good place where you can say, essentially, I want to create a shortcut to this line of code, and I want to go back to it frequently. You can persist that in the task list. Also, if you put to-do comments in your code that you want to go back to, they automatically show up in the task list. So it's a really good kind of place to stay and see what needs to be done next. So I'll go up here. I've chosen the student profile. Also, off to the left, we have this dynamic help window. We'll talk a lot about that during this demo. But the dynamic help window basically follows what you're doing in the IDE and tries to present the most appropriate help topics or links to the help topics based on what you're trying to do. So in this case, I have a Solution Explorer open. There's a help for the Solution Explorer, help for how to work with solutions, projects, and files. There's samples here, student edition samples, and a bunch of getting started information. So if you're new to VisualStudio.net, we can really help you get started in a first-class way. Now I'll go, after I've chosen my profile, I'm just going to go to Get Started here. And the Get Started page is essentially your most recently used file list. And from here I can open projects I've worked on before or create new projects. I'll move down to the next tab, which is called What's New. And as the name implies, this tells you what's new in Visual Studio. Again, if you're new to the environment, this is a great place to start and get familiar with all the great things in Visual Studio. The next link is a very interesting one, and this gives you a link into the online community. The start page actually gets XML from the MSDN online site and then repurposes it and shows it to you as useful links that are updated frequently.
So this is actually interacting with the website on the internet itself?
Absolutely. Essentially, it's a web service. We're pinging MSDN online, we're getting XML content, we're bringing that XML content down to the IDE, then we're running some XSL transforms on it and displaying it in the IDE. So the benefit here to the developer is they can get the most up-to-date information that's available on MSDN online directly from within the IDE. So here, for instance, there's various websites and news groups that I can go peruse at my leisure. Here's the MSDN headlines, both headlines, the news, and various columns that might be appropriate to me as a developer. Search online. So again, if I want to get the latest help that might be available online but wasn't in my CDs that came with Visual Studio, I can go right here and get that. For instance, if I want to know more about the .NET show, I'm not sure what you do, so we click on .NET show. This is searching MSDN online, and I can see there's 30 hits here. And the .NET show, what is .NET? Click on that, and it brings you to this column here so I can learn more about .NET. So we're really trying to take the best of the web and integrate that into the IDE to make more useful information available to you as a developer. Go back here. So that was headlines, search online, downloads. We know developers love sample code and downloads, so we put that right in the start page for you so you can get the latest downloads, like here, the new DirectX SDK, Office XP stuff, sample code, and reference material. And again, this constantly updates as you use the product. Web hosting we mentioned in the previous section, and we'll demo that later. But again, this allows you to put your web applications and web services on the internet. Now these bottom four tabs, many of you may not see this in Beta 2. This is our academic edition. And again, this allows faculty members and students to really have a rich experience in doing courseware in Visual Studio.net. In this case, I'll pretend that I'm a student, and we'll have a home page or start page just for students. And again, this comes from MSDN online, but it's focused on academic content. So I can learn more about the academic editions of Visual Studio, get technical articles, samples for students, and other miscellaneous cool stuff. But let's say I've, in Computer Science 101, I'm enrolled in that class, and my teacher said, okay, I want you to enroll in the set of assignments that are up there on the server for you. The first thing the teacher will do is give me a URL to go to enroll in that course. So within the IDE, I'll click on Add Course. I'll enter a URL. In this case, it's just local, so I'll go on my local hard drive, and I'll hit Add. And then I get a bunch of information about that course. The course description, and it says it's an entry-level course to learn VB.NET. There's links, in this case to the Microsoft website, and then there's the set of assignments that are associated with that course. There's only one class here, and it's called Hello World, your first VB.NET application, so I'll go ahead and download that. I'll give it a name called Hello World. So what it's done, it's gone out to that URL, brought down that assignment directly into my IDE. And it brought me to that home page here, Microsoft.com. The faculty member would probably have a starter page which is more appropriate for learning this particular assignment. But if I look down here in the task list, there's one task, and it says enter code to display a Hello World message box. So if I just double click on that, it brings me to that line of code that I'm now supposed to implement.
And this was the code that you downloaded as part of this course that the teacher, the instructor put together and allowed all the students that would enroll in the course to download automatically.
Absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, when the instructor built this assignment, he or she wrote the code that was actually implemented, made sure that the results that he or she wanted were gathered, and then used the thing where we allow you to highlight the student code. And what that does is it erases the student code from the assignment that you send down to the student. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, the to-do here is say enter code to display a message box. Well, let's say I think I understand. I used to do BASIC a long time ago, so I'll start typing message box, and I think that's the right thing to do. And if I look in the dynamic help window, again, it's tracking what I'm doing. It knows I'm on the message box keyword. And here we go, message box function is the first link here. So I can go ahead and click on that and bring up help on the message box function directly in the IDE. Okay, now we know, this is another interesting aspect about the development environment. We know that some people love help integrated into the IDE, and we know other people love it outside of the IDE. So we give you the option to either have the help integrated right in or outside.
So it could have opened up as a separate window if I said it in that fashion.
Yes. We did surveys on it, and exactly 50 people liked it in, and exactly 50 people liked it out. So we put it in by default because we really like the integrated nature of that, but you can easily change that if you'd like. So here's the great help on the message box, tells me how to use that. Good. So now I'll just go back to my form here, and the thing I want to do is just type in hello world. You see the great parameter tips there to help me understand how to use this function. And let's say I just by accident remove that end paren and move off the line. If you notice here, there's a little blue squiggly here, and in the task list, it's saying...
Squiggly, that must be the technical term for that, right?
Squiggly, yes. I don't know how else to refer to it as, but there's a little squiggly here, because there is a syntax here on this line. I forgot the end paren. And if I look in the task list, it's telling me that immediately. In Visual Basic 6, for instance, you'd have a message box pop up and kind of stop the flow of working. In C++ and previous versions, you'd have to compile the application first to then find out you had an error. Again, we're trying to make developers more productive by showing them what's wrong and what's right to do directly while they're coding. So in this case, it says I'm expecting an end paren. Oh, I think I know how to fix that pretty easy. I just put the end paren there, and two things happen there. The first thing, if you look here, it bolded the parens. That's a new feature in the editor now where you can see the matching paren. And as I move off the line there, you see the blue squiggly went away, indicating that that's a valid statement. So now I'll go ahead and just run the simplest of applications. The output window tells me what's going on. I go into debug mode, and I get my little hello world message box. Now the next step of this application is very straightforward. I can just now send this up to the instructor. The instructor will make sure that it was sent in on time. The instructor can auto-build it and essentially give me a grade on this assignment automatically without having to do that as a manual step.
Well, that sounds really useful. I mean, some of my teachers would have really enjoyed doing that, and probably would have made my work a lot simpler and wouldn't have to be dumping those cards on the computer science room all that time.
Exactly. So,
are you actually beta testing this at any schools at all right now?
Yes, we are. There are some major universities we're testing it with now. And the good news about this, well, I showed you it in Visual Basic. This absolutely works in C# and Visual C++ as well, and third-party academic languages. So if an institution plugs in Haskell or Scheme, it can take advantage of this set of services as well.
So how would a school get a hold of this version of Visual Studio?
We have the MSDN Academic Alliance, very inexpensive way to get Visual Studio. So if you're a computer science department, you want the students, the faculty to have access to Visual Studio. It's a very inexpensive way to do that. Also in university bookstores, obviously we have a highly discounted version of Visual Studio which includes the student tools.
Okay. I'll make sure I get a link from you guys for the website for this stuff and include it in the transcript at the bottom of the page.
Excellent. Okay. So now I'm going to hand it over to Rob.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is focus on creating a .NET application. And we talked in the last segment about how Visual Studio.NET makes creating those applications really simple. So I want to show a very simple web service. This is going to be the first step. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home page, or the start page, and go to my profile because Peter left this set with these windows over here on the left and I don't like them there. So I'm going to go and change this to Visual Basic Developer. Now move the windows on the right. I'm used to that. I like that. And then I'll come up here to get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do is click New Project. And as we talked about earlier, we've got a completely integrated environment. So in this new project dialog, I see project types for Visual Basic and C# and C++ and so forth. I'm going to stay in Visual Basic for this one, and over on the right-hand side, I've got several different choices. What I want to create is a web service. So I'm going to choose ASP.NET Web Service, and I can give that thing a name. And let's pretend that I work for a company that provides items of some sort to people, and I want to have a web service to allow them to place orders with me. So they don't have to call me on the phone, or they don't have to go to my web page. They can integrate their own applications with my application and just directly enter orders across the internet. So I'll call this the Order Service Web Service. And now notice down here that at location, when I choose a web service, it actually has an HTTP address. So I can place this out on a web server and then interact with it just the same way that everybody else is going to interact with it. And Visual Studio interacts with it that way as well. So I'll push OK. And what's happening is Visual Studio is going to the web server, which in this case happens to be my machine, but it could just as easily be another box somewhere else. And it's creating an application route, and then it's copying the files from my project up there for me.
Do you have any like firewall considerations in that project, or can you be like inside of a firewall accessing someone outside and vice versa?
I can be both inside and outside in access, and as we'll show in just in a minute here, when we post this up onto one of our web hoster sites, that's going to be outside of our firewall, and we can post it up there. So I've got a set of files that it puts in my project for me. The one that's highlighted right now is called Service1, and this is the actual file that is the web service. And in many ways, it's just a class. So if I'm a C++ programmer or a Visual Basic programmer, I think of this thing essentially as a class. Now, something new that we've got in VisualStudio.net is this design surface that's filling most of the screen here. In previous versions, classes were just represented by code, and you would type a lot of code. In this version, you can still do that, and as a matter of fact, we will. But we've got this great new feature that allows me to more easily integrate other components inside of my class, and I'll show how that works in just a minute. But just to do the simplest of things, I'm going to go to the code view here. As we can see, this is just a simple class. It's called Public Class Service 1. And there's some sample code in here for me already, but instead of using that, I'm just going to create a method on this class. So I'm going to say, it's in Visual Basic, so I'll say public function, and I want to call my service place order. So that'll allow people to place an order. And I'm going to let them pass me some information, and I'll call that information order info. And just to keep this simple, we'll say it's a string. In real life, it probably would be some data structure of some sort, but we'll just call it a string. And we'll say that this function returns a Boolean, so I can return true or false, depending on whether it was successful when they called me. Now, that's pretty much it. This is how I created a method on a class in Visual Basic before, and I used the same knowledge that I already had to create a web service. I just need to do one more thing. We've got this new feature called attributes. And attributes allow me to mark up functions, methods, properties, to give the runtime a hint about how I want this thing treated. And in this case, I want this thing treated as a web method so that it's callable over the internet. So I'm just going to say, this is a web method. I put that attribute on here and move off the line. And now this function is available over the web.
So it's going to know how to marshal up all together, all of the features and capabilities across the SOAP transaction to another machine somewhere else across the internet.
Exactly. And I didn't have to know anything about that. I just treat it just like an object or just like a method. So let's just make something really simple. I'm going to say return true. That's the only thing this is going to do. Now, one of the other great features that the runtime has added for us is the ability to easily test these web services. In the past, if I were creating a component, I would have to write a test harness to call the component and call its methods to make sure that it was working properly. And I can still do that, and I probably would here. But if I don't want to do that, if I just want to check it out as fast as possible, I'll just press F5 to run this web service in the environment. Now what that does, Visual Studio compiles my web service application, sends it over to the web service, and makes it available to be, or sends it over to the web server, rather, and makes it available to be called. And then what it does is opens up Internet Explorer and navigates to the URL that represents that service. Now, most of the time, you wouldn't be sending your browser directly to the service. Your application would be interacting with it. And once you actually put this out on the internet, you can turn this feature off so that malicious people can't actually get at the service without the proper credentials. But what I'm going to do here is look at the page that gets returned for me. This is a page that's automatically generated, and it shows me that my service is called Service 1, and it shows me the methods that are available to call. In this case, I have one. It's called that place order. There's some other information down here on the bottom, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm going to click on place order, and this takes me to a page that lets me test my service. So here's the order info parameter that I just specified, and I'll just say I'm going to pass Hess and click invoke. It's going to call the web service. My code is going to run, and I returned true in my code. And if we look here in the browser now, what I've got is true. So it executed the code and returned true. Now the most interesting thing I think here is this is an XML. So it's returning, it's actually sending and returning all these requests using XML, but as a developer, I just thought about it as returning the value true from an object. I didn't have to know how to form the XML. I didn't have to know anything about how that all happens. It's taken care of for me automatically.
Like tempuri.org, isn't that some sort of Japanese food. I mean, I know nothing about XML, and the great thing about Visual Studio and Visual Basic creating XML applications, it abstracts it away from you if you want it, if you don't want to learn all of that information.
Right.
If you are really comfortable looking at XML and raw HTML, all of that is available to you as well.
So you can still get to from that standpoint.
Right.
Like right now we're seeing the XML on the screen. Does this mean that if I'm writing an application that's interacting with your web service, that now I've got to take and understand XML in order to understand this true value coming back at me?
Well, that's a great question. If we're using Visual Studio, absolutely not. What I need to understand is objects. And I'll show in a minute, I'm going to create a client application that uses my web service. And what your client application gets back is the value true. So you're just still treating it like a value true or an integer or a long, and under the covers it's coming back as XML, but you don't have to know that. So let's take this, we talked earlier about our web hosting feature. Now that we've got just a simple little web service here, why don't we post it up onto one of our web hoster sites? You want to do that,
Yeah,
Peter?
that sounds great.
And show how easy that
Okay.
is.
So I'll just go back to the start page again. And I'll
switch the menus across the other side.
yes, I don't like your layout, Rob. No. I'll go back to the web hosting tab. And here you just get a link to our third-party web hosters. And this will change over time. There'll be more in there. But at this point, we have Brinkster. I've already created an account with Brinkster. I could sign up directly from within the IDE. But I'll just choose this command here, which says upload directly to your Brinkster account. So I'll click that. I'll type in my username and password. Now it's connecting to Brinkster, and it's going to show me two things. First thing it's going to show me is on the left side here are my current projects in my solution that I might want to upload to Brinkster. On the right-hand side, I already see the files that are up there in my local account up on Brinkster. So in this case, I just want to choose the order service, that's the name of the project, and hit upload. So at this point, it's grabbing the files in my project and then sending them up to Brinkster. In a moment, they'll be up there, and then I'll be able to use that web service across the internet, just like that. So really,
these people are like ISPs or web service providers?
yes,
like
yeah,
that?
they're ISPs who focus on web hosting, and we have a great arrangement with them where they're making available .NET servers with all of the right infrastructure in place to run your .NET applications. Also a great thing about it, some of the services are free. So you can actually get your feet wet, try it, put your web service up there for free, and as you need more, like bandwidth, as you need more, let's say you want to really use SQL Server in a big way, you want to have more than just 5 gigabytes or 10 gigabytes, you need 100 gigabytes of data, they will make that available to you at a premium charge. So
now, if I was working for a company that had my own internal web services, would I add that to this list somehow, or would I do some other method for getting my web hosting provided via VisualStudio.net?
Well, probably the easiest way in your corporation is that your MIS director would tell you the appropriate place to put your web services. This is really meant for if you're going out beyond your firewall and you're going out and you want to host on a third-party site. Okay. So it's been uploaded to that site, so let's go ahead and now navigate to that site. I'll bring up Internet Explorer here. I'll click on links and click on the top URL. And there we go. So this is the actual web service that Rob just created running on the internet in front of us. So that's how web hosting works.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty easy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've got that up there, why don't we'll go back to Visual Studio, and we have a web service, and it's cool and it was easy to do, but it doesn't do anything. So let's actually make it do something and show some of the other great features that we've
Return
added.
true, isn't that something?
Yes, well, that is something. It's always true, and nothing can change that. So, so I'm going to go back. Here's the code again that we had. And I'm going to go back to this design surface and talk a little bit more about this. As I said before, this is a design surface on top of that class that allows me to easily use components. So if you think about Visual Basic, for example, in the past, if I were creating a form, I always had a palette of controls, and I could drag those controls onto the form and set properties on them without having to write any code. So I could just focus the code that I wanted to write on the logic behind the form. We wanted to do the same thing with classes. So what we've provided, if I look at the toolbox and click on the Components tab, we've got a set of components here that I can now use for my class, and I can just drag them onto the surface. So I've got an event log if I want to use the Windows NT event log, or a directory searcher to search directories, use message queues. And these are all extensible by third parties, but we've got quite a few of them that we're shipping with. So I just take these and drag them on here, set their properties, and then I don't have to write the code to instantiate them. They just happen automatically. Another tool that we've got in Visual Studio that works with this designer as well is called the Server Explorer. And I'm going to open that up here. The Server Explorer allows me to take a look at my server, this one that I'm running, and various other servers as long as I have permission in my enterprise, and look at the services that are available there and use them very easily. So if I look at this server, it's called Robert Co. VS. And if I expand the node, I can see that I've got Crystal services running on here, my event logs are on here, message queues, and so forth, performance counters. Now let's say that for this application I'm writing, I want to track with the performance counter every time an order comes in, so that I can just easily go to the machine, look at the performance counter, and see how many orders have come in. And I can also watch as they go up, hopefully, not down. So if I expand, let me make this window a little bit bigger. If I expand performance counters, we'll see that this machine has a whole host of performance counters already on it. There's some for the .NET runtime, there's some ASP, and so forth. But I want to create one that's for me, for orders. So right from this window in Visual Studio, I can right-click and say Create New Category. And I'm going to create a category of performance counters called Orders. And then I can create new counters down here at the bottom. So I'm going to create one called Orders Placed to track how many orders that I've placed. And I'll click OK. Now that's...
Are these similar to the perfmon?
Yes, these
counters?
I will, as a matter of fact, I'll show this in perfmon
Okay.
because it is just that. And for the people that are watching this that have tried to write performance counters and use perfmon and event log, especially from Visual Basic in the past, it's really quite a challenge. It takes a lot of coding and a lot of expertise, and we've tried to encapsulate a bunch of the services that you would normally use on a server to make it very easy to use in your web services. So if I scroll down here now, I've got a category called Orders, and here's my orders placed. Now I'm just going to take this and drag it out here and use it on in my class. And now, instead of having to write the code to create the instance and then set all the default properties, if I look at the property window, they're already set for me. They're already set to look at this machine, they're already set up, except read-only is set to true, and I really want that to be false so that I can write to the performance counter. So I'll change that property. And then let's say I also want to use the event log. So if I have errors in my web service, I can send them to the event log, and then an administrator can come and take a look later and see what happened. So I'll look at my event log, and I'll drag the application portion of the event log and use that as well. So now I've got these two objects. If I go back to my code and I want this thing to actually do something, I can just write a simple couple lines of code, and I can say performance counter 1, which is the name that gave, performance counter 1 dot increment by 1. So I'm incrementing my performance counter by 1, and since I'm hoping that everything works fine, I'm not going to have any errors to write to the event log. I'll just write every order that comes into the event log. So I'll say event log 1 dot write entry. And one thing I want to note here is that statement completion, where I've got this tip that tells me about how to use this function, we've added some features to that to make it even easier. Now that we've got inheritance in the languages and we've got a framework that's built on inheritance, we could have methods that are overloaded. And this particular method is overloaded. There are 10 of them there. And I can scroll through all the different versions of this method and see what parameters they take, and it helps me type along. And I just happen to know here.
Well, let's say I wanted to find out more information about all those 10 methods.
Well, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
Let's bring up that dynamic help window that Peter was talking about earlier. And if I just click on this write entry, right over here in dynamic help, I've got write entry method right here, and I can click on it and go right to help for it. So this makes it a lot easier rather than having to go to the help and search for it or press F1 and get something that maybe isn't exactly what I want. It's watching exactly what I'm doing, and here's all the information. It knows that I'm a VB programmer, so it shows me a sample in VB. If I were in a C# application, it would show me the sample in C#, and I can tell it to show me all of them if I'd like, but it's a pretty smart system to know what I'm doing right now and show me what I'm doing.
Yeah, there's a very rich context service behind the dynamic help system. So it knows now that Rob is working on a web service. It knows that Rob's working on a VB web service. It now knows that he's inside of a public function, that's a web method. And then finally, it knows that he's writing write entry on an event log object. So it captures all of that information and applies a massive filter across There's at least 300,000 help topics just to bring back the right help topics.
Are those help topics coming from the local hard drive, from the CD, or from the internet, or from where?
In this case, we have it running from the local CD player, or the CD-ROM. You could download it onto your hard drive, or you could put it on somewhere in your corporate intranet. Also, with the start page, you saw that you have the ability to integrate with online content that's available on MSDN Online.
So let's go ahead and finish this up. I'm gonna write an entry to the log, and I'm gonna create a category called My Orders. And then maybe I would just want to say that an order was placed. And as a matter of fact, I want to send to the event log this order info that I'm passing in. So I'll add that in here. And so with just 2 lines of code now, I'm going to increment my performance counter, and I'm going to write an entry into the event log. So let's go ahead. I've got performance counter open, or the performance monitor. I'm going to add. And I'm going to go through here and choose, well, I was kind of hoping that orders was there, so maybe it needs to refresh. So let's just close it and start it up again. And now add, oh, there we go, orders. And there's the orders placed that we added. Okay, so that's at 0. And if I look at my event viewer, there are no entries in there. So now I'm going to go ahead and run this again, and we'll do the same thing that we just did. We'll get that page that you wouldn't normally see if you were actually using this thing from an app, but since I'm a developer and I want to easily test it, I'm going to go in and call this place order thing again and say, here's an order, and call it. So it returns true. Now if I go over here to my performance counter, you can kind of see that there's 1.
If I have to place some more orders.
Yeah, if I go back to, let me get the windows lined up the way I want them. If I go back to my web page and start refreshing it over and over, so I'm calling the order service over and over, you can see the line going up. And then if I go to my event viewer and refresh it, now I've got a bunch of entries that are my orders, where they, and here I typed, here's an order. So with pretty little code, I was able to use a lot of the services that are on this machine and integrate them nicely with my web service. So one last thing that I want to do to this web service to make it truly useful, I'd like my customers to be able to ask for a catalog. And my catalog is stored in SQL Server. I have SQL Server running on this machine. So we're going to add one more method to this thing that's called getCatalog, and it's going to return the catalog. So I'm going to go back to the Server Explorer, and there's another node up here called Data Connections, and that lets me connect to the various servers that I might have that provide data, like SQL Server. And I just happen to have a table in here called Products, and that's the product. So I'm going to drag that out onto the same surface that I was using for my other components. Get a couple errors because we're in beta right now.
And just a couple things. That Server Explorer is one of the many shared tools in the Visual Studio environment. The SQL access in Visual Studio is great. We have great SQL debugging. As a matter of fact, the whole debugging story in Visual Studio is greatly improved over previous versions. We have cross-language and cross-machine debugging. So again, if you're creating a multi-tiered application in different languages, you have the ability to debug all the way through that.
Since it's all one big environment you're working with.
I wouldn't call it big. It's one integrated,
one integrated environment.
Yes.
Another important note, I think, for the Server Explorer is it's extensible. So third parties can plug. We saw Crystal Services listed there. That's where Crystal Reports lives. And other third parties can plug their own items onto that so that you can manage and use their server-side components very easily as well. So what I got when I drugged my products table on, I got actually 2 things. I got SQL Connection 1, which allows me to connect to my SQL server. And then I have SQL Data Adapter 1, and that's the thing that lets me send and receive data to and from the SQL server. So I can call stored procedures using that. I can create my own queries. Since I didn't create one, it's just going to do a select star on the table for me. So what I want to do is create what's called a data set. And there's a command over here on the property window to allow me to do that. And a data set is an XML representation of data. It's both a schema, which describes the data, and also can contain the data. And I'm going to use that as a way to get data from SQL Server and then send it back across the web to someone who asks for it in a web standard way. So it's represented as XML. Even though I'm saying all of that, I don't need to know it. All I need to know is that I'm creating this thing called a data set to hold my data and send it around. So I'm going to call this catalog. And down here it says I want to use products. I could have many tables in this data set. I'm just going to have this one. I'm going to click OK. And now what we've done is we've gone off and created that XML description of this data. I'm going to open, we've got a new designer called the XML designer. And we'll see here that graphically I've got this thing that represents my products table. And it has the same structure as the table that came from SQL Server. And if I'm not really into XML, this is all I need to know. I can add other tables here. I can change what's in this table, all graphically. Or
So here you're editing XML there.
I am editing XML graphically.
I mean, it just looks like a database table.
Right, right. And we wanted to make it look that way so that it was easy to understand and use when you're using data. But if I do know XML, I can switch to XML view, and you'll see that we've got a colorized editor here for XML. I can go and add a new line. I get statement completion on the XML. So it's all very rich, but I don't want to do that because it's set up just the way I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of there. And now I've got everything I need to create my service. So what I can do is I can go add a new function here. So I'm going to say, once again, web method, public function get catalog. And this is just going to return a catalog, that data set that I just created. And now in here, what I want to do is, first I need to create an instance of the catalog to fill. So I'm going to say dim my catalog as new catalog. Now I've got a new catalog. And then what I need to do is just use that SQL data adapter that I had to ask the SQL Server for the data. So I'm going to say SQL Server or SQL data adapter 1 dot fill and pass it my catalog. What that does is it fills my catalog with the data, and then I just return my catalog. And now my web service is ready to go. So let's go ahead and create a Windows application that can call these web services, because we've shown the creation of the service itself, but we also make it very easy to create applications to use those web services.
So this is not a website, web page calling a web service. We actually create a Windows smart client application calling a web service.
Yes, because we've got great integration to show how you can get a nice, rich client experience. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to say, let's create a new project. Now again, I'm going to do this in Visual Basic, but I could do it in C# just as easily. This time.
And with this dialog, not only could he create an additional Visual Basic project with the existing Visual Basic project to have a solution with multiple projects, you can create solutions from different languages together. So if Rob decided to do C#, a C# front end and a Visual Basic back end, you can do that all within one solution. So you can edit, debug, compile, build all in one environment at the same time.
All using the multiple languages set up between different projects like that.
Yes,
great,
exactly.
Great.
So let's just call this project catalog. And I'll just create a client application that can call that web service and display my catalog in a grid. Something simple. So I get a form that looks very similar to the kind of form you'd get in Visual Basic in the past. And it is very similar. We've added a lot of great new features to the Forms designer. But let's just go ahead. I'm going to go and change the background color because gray has been overused, and let's make it white. That'll be so much nicer. So we'll get that. We'll come over here to the toolbox where I get all my controls. And I'm going to grab a data grid and put that on here and size it kind of how I want it. And then I'll come and get a button and put that on here. And all of these controls, many of them are similar and familiar to our customers, and many of them have great new features to let them do even more things. For example, the button has a new property called flat style. And since flat seems to be in right now, I'm going to make the button flat so it doesn't have that 3D look.
Kind of retro it looks like.
Yeah, yeah. We want to have a retro, the white look and the flat look. And so now I've got a form. Now, one of the other things I want this form to be able to do, when people size it, like if I size it, everything just stays. And one of the things that people have had to do in the past is write a lot of code to get the sizing to work right so that the controls stretch. And that code is tedious to write, and it's easy to get errors in it. So we've added a great new feature that allows me to automatically size things. So I've got an anchor property. So I'm going to click on the grid. I'm going to go up here and choose anchor. And I'm going to say I want to anchor it to the top and left, which it already is. And I also want to anchor it to the bottom and the right. And then I'm going to click the button, and it also has an anchor property. And got a few click problems here. There we go. Now instead, I don't want the button anchored to the top and the left. I only want it anchored to the bottom and the right, so it moves. Now if I size my form, even at design time, my controls size properly, so I don't have to write any code to do that. Makes it very nice. And the last thing I'm going to do, I want to change the font size on these things because I think it's kind of small. And in the past, I'd have to select the controls and set the font size for each control. So we've added a feature so that if I select the form and choose font, and then we'll change it to, say, 14, all the controls on the form pick it up. So now the grid and the button are now font size 14. So now that I've got my rich form, which admittedly isn't that rich, but you can imagine that it could be much richer, I want to call that web service from my Windows desktop. Now, in past versions of Visual Basic, if I wanted to use a component, I would set a reference to the component and then I would use it. And we've got a similar functionality for the web. If I right-click on my project, I have Add Reference, which does what I just said, but I also have a new feature, Add Web Reference. This allows me to point to a web service and start using it. When I choose that, I get this new dialog that allows me, first of all, it's integrated with Microsoft's UDDI services, so I can search the UDDI directory for services that various businesses might offer. I can go up here to the address bar and type in, for example, the Brinkster address that we just posted up there. Or I can just click down here and say, show me the web references that are on my local machine. Now, we've got some work to do yet on how this all looks, so we'll ignore this XML on the left.
What's wrong with XML? Perfectly easy to read.
XML is very easy to read, and you'll see it's colorized even, so it's very nice. But I'm going to look over here to the right and see what web services are on this machine. Here's this order service that I just created. So I'll click it. And then inside of that order service project, I could have multiple web services. I've only got one called Service 1, so I'll say Add a Reference. Now, Visual Studio is actually creating all of the plumbing necessary for my client to call that web service and make it appear as if I just have an object on my machine, when really it's actually going out across the internet to call that thing.
So it's making like a proxy stub DLL that's taking all the SOAP wrappers and wrapping it all up so it calls the internet services.
Exactly.
On the web. Yeah.
Exactly, and it does that all automatically. Again, you can get pretty fine-grained control if you really wanted to, but for the most cases, this is all you need.
Yeah, on a previous episode, I had some friends from Salt Mine showing how to connect to web services, and they intentionally were using just command line tools, and they showed the actual manually building those proxies and stuff like that. Here, you just click a button, and you're done.
Yes, yes, it makes it pretty easy. So let's click on this button and actually fill this grid with our catalog. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an instance of the web service, just as I'd create an instance of a component if I were going to use Mappy or something like that. So I'll say dim WS as new. And the way we name these web services is we take the machine name. So in this case, it's localhost because it's running on this machine. So I see localhost dot, and then the service, service 1. So now I've got my web service that I can call. Now the other thing I need to do, if you remember, we created something called a catalog that was a data set that's going to get the data back and forth. I need to create a variable to hold that in when I call my web service. So I'm going to dim my catalog as localhost.catalog. And now I'll call the web service. I say WS, well actually I'll say my catalog equals WS dot, and there's get catalog. So that makes the web service call, goes out, calls it, gets the data back as XML, packages it up, puts it into my catalog. And if I want to fill the grid, I'll just say datagrid1.dataSource equals my catalog.products. If you remember, my catalog, or the catalog, had one table called products. It could have many, so I need to specify which one that I want here. And that's it.
That's too simple.
It is too simple. So let's press F5 and see that if it actually works, then we'll show that it's too simple, but it still works. So I've got my form. If I size it, yes, it sizes correctly. If I press the button, we're going out and making that call, getting the data from SQL Server, bringing it back as XML, and there we go. It's put in the grid and showing me all of my products.
Wow.
So there you have it. A simple walkthrough.
So in a complex application, which that actually was a fairly complex application when you thought was actually going underneath it, but a complex app like writing Excel or Word or stuff like that would interact with the web could just as easily have been making calls, calling back on the back-end server here at Microsoft.com or somewhere else to get access to information just by adding those few lines of code to their applications.
Yes, absolutely. We made it very easy, not only on these rich client applications. As I talked about earlier, we have a web forms designer that lets me create nice HTML user interface that interacts with this web service the exact same way, the same steps that I would use. Or if I was writing another web service and wanted to aggregate other web services out there, I'd do the same thing. I'd set a reference to it and just use it as if it were on my machine.
I know at a certain level, I can see more smart client applications taking advantage of web services in this programmatic fashion like this, and really creating almost a new class of application that we haven't really had too much availability of yet, where it's not actually a browser interface that the user is being forced to interact with, but a programmatic interaction between an application and web services.
Exactly. Yes.
Absolutely.
So I mean, we've seen an awful lot of stuff that VS.NET does here now, and I'm sure we've seen everything it has capable of adding to it. There's nothing else that
yes.
No,
VS.NET's
we
doing.
could go on for hours,
Yes.
Robert. I mean, there's so
We
many.
can go on for a couple minutes. Why don't you?
Okay, a couple minutes. Well, there's so many features. I'm not even sure where to begin. On the environment side, we have a great extensibility model now. Again, so if you're a Visual Basic or a C# or a C++ ISV and you want to build add-ins and wizards for Visual Studio, it's easier than it's ever been before. It's more powerful than it's ever been before. If you're a developer in Visual Studio, you can customize the environment in N ways, or N by N ways. It really is that flexible. We also have a great macro recording and editing environment. So if you want to create your own special editor customizations or other environment customizations, you have a full-blown environment to do that as well. We have things like color printing, word wrap in HTML, find and replace in files. I could just keep going on. Multi-monitor support, command windows, and so on. It's really kind of exciting. And make sure you take the opportunity to visit the website at Microsoft, go to MSDN, see some of the shows that we're coming out with to learn more about Visual Studio and the environment that it's in.
And I'll make sure I include some links that are available on the bottom of the transcript windows. People can actually find out more information on how to go to it. Now, I mean, since there's so much involved in VS.NET, and also I know that since your specialty is Visual Basic, what I'd like to do is have a future episode where we're talking about VB.NET and some of the characteristics specific to a VB developer and what they need to think about, especially in migrating to using .NET, using the VB environment, as well as making great Visual Basic applications, if you don't mind.
Oh, I think that'd be great.
Okay, well,
I'd love
thanks.
to.
Well, thanks both of you. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for joining me.
Thank
Thank you.
Well, hopefully this gave you a little bit of insight of what VS.NET can do to assist you in developing a great .NET application. Now remember, you can develop both a web-based application or, like we showed here, a Windows-based application calling web services using VS.NET and the great .NET environment. So make sure you take a look at this tool and see how it can help you out.
In these interviews, we've met a lot of people who do work mainly here in Redmond, but today we're going to talk with somebody whose job is to focus on people who work all over the world for Microsoft. With me is Amy Stranda. She is a lead program manager for MSDN and TechNet field content. Amy, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell me what your job is about. What is it to work with field content?
Well, my job is really my team's job. I can't do it alone without them. But we create content kits for the field worldwide. And these content kits, either for the MSDN stream for developer focused or for TechNet, the IT pro focused people. The content kits consist of PowerPoint slides, demos, demo scripts, platform images, and training media that we ship to the field worldwide. And then they use this content customized for their customers and their districts, their locations, and present local MSDN and TechNet events.
So how often do the field events occur?
It varies from region to region, district to district. Either it could be weekly, depending on the presenter. It could be monthly, 3 times a month, 4 times a month. It really varies.
So it's pretty much like constant mini conferences that are happening, training events, just to get people out there aware of what's coming out of Microsoft.
Exactly. And they're very future thinking as far as the MSDN events go. We're doing stuff now on .NET. We've done stuff in the servers. We will do Hailstorm as soon as we can. And the IT Pro as well. It's cutting edge stuff. We ship stuff for the .NET for IT Pros this quarter.
Okay. So what's an average day for you? What's it take to do your job?
Oh, that's a tough one. Because we are on a 4-month development cycle, when we ship every 3 months, it depends on where we are in the cycle. It could be acquiring the content, writing the content, testing the content, shipping the content. It just goes through the whole cycle, and this happens every quarter for us.
Okay. So can you talk about what new projects you're working on for field content?
Besides just our regular quarterly content that we ship out, we also do Tech Ed event content. For Tech Ed 2001, we are doing a hands-on lab based on our content. My team is also focused on Dev Days. We're doing a lot of content for Dev Days 2001 in November. We're making sure the content gets written and has a consistent message and look and feel, so that when the Dev Days event is going on worldwide, it's the same content and consistent content from what we want.
Okay, so people watching the show might be able to see a Tech Ed.
Yeah, definitely.
So how long have you been at Microsoft?
It'll be 3 years in July.
Okay, what other type of jobs have you done here?
My first job was product manager for MSMQ, Microsoft Message Queuing Services, and I did that for a year, and then I got into the MSDN field content, and then our teams merged with TechNet, and we have now the MSDN and TechNet field content.
Okay.
And before that, I was actually at Microsoft in the mastering group as a contractor, working on creating content for the mastering series, which is now MSDN training.
Okay. And were you also in the technical field before you came to Microsoft?
Yes, I was. I was at a solution provider in Chicago, and what I did there was corporate training of internet technologies, access databases. Then I found the content that I was presenting I didn't like too much, so then I created my own. So I got into content authoring, and then I came to Microsoft to work with the mastering group.
So are there some similarities with the kind of work you did before Microsoft and what you're doing now?
Some similarities, yeah.
Yeah.
It's always been teaching for me. I went to college to be a high school math and computer science teacher.
Oh, really?
So I've had teaching kind of in my blood. So I went from corporate training to the corporate world, and now I'm creating content in bite-sized pieces where training is 2 or 3 days of content. My sessions now are about an hour and a half to 2 hours in length.
And you said you studied to be a high school teacher. Did you actually do that for a while?
I taught 8th grade.
8th grade?
Yeah.
How was that?
It was fun. The 8th graders are great. I got to teach not just math and computer science, but history and art and reading and PE and all that fun stuff. It's a good age.
That's great. So tell me about what kind of things you do outside of work for fun.
Probably my strongest passion right now is football, American football. I've been playing football since college. I was Powder Puff team and then flag football.
Yeah?
And was on many winning teams here in Seattle on the flag football co-ed team. But now in Seattle there's a new league starting. It's the Women's American Football League. It's a professional women's full tackle, full contact football team.
Really?
Yeah.
Full everything, just
everything.
all female.
Full pads, helmet, cleats, everything.
And that's starting up soon?
Yes, there's tryouts June 16th, so I haven't made the team. I'm hoping to make the team, but I'll try out with the rest of them on June 16th. It's for the Seattle Warbirds.
That's great. Is there a certain position that you'd like to do ideally?
Yeah, I would prefer defense, defensive line or linebacker, depending on where they want me, but I will play any position they want to put me in, offense or defense.
Yeah. So you don't mind getting pushed around and wear the full helmets and everything. That's great.
I love it. Of course, I haven't put on the full pads yet because they haven't given it to us yet until we make the team. So I don't even know what it feels like yet.
Right. So who's your favorite NFL team?
The Vikings.
Yeah.
It has to be the Vikings. I got married in Minnesota, so it has to be the Minnesota Vikings.
Well, Amy, thanks for joining me. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you very much, Erica.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the .NET Show.
And stay tuned for the next episode where we'll talk about VB.NET.
And until then, we'll see you on the web.